Welcome. Today I am joined with Dr. Catherine Sandler, an executive coach and author. We're going to be exploring her psychodynamic approaches to coaching, looking at the coaching relationship and our unconscious emotions as drivers, as well as looking at how do we balance this idea of working with a psychodynamic approach without tipping into therapy as coaches. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to be speaking with you today, and I really enjoyed reading through your book around, executive coaching and psychodynamic approaches. It was a real, I wouldn't say an eye-opener, but I guess a real reminder about some things for me, and it really stimulated my thinking about how we can bring other approaches, other frameworks into our practice. And how we can pull on different ideas. And maybe to get us started, if you could do maybe a little bit of a brief history of you and your work, and then we'll dive into your sort of frameworks.
Okay. Well, I've been coaching leaders, mainly in the business sector, but also in other organizations for about 25 years now. And I still enjoy it as much today, actually, as I did when I started. So I feel very fortunate in what I do. It's a really fascinating journey with each client that I work with, and that hasn't paled at all. I bring, a number of perspectives and approaches to the work that I do, but it's true that the psychodynamic lens that I apply, I do find incredibly helpful in working both at pace, because the clients I coach want to feel that they're getting results from the coaching fairly quickly. They're usually very practical people, and they want to feel that they have gained benefit from it in a tangible way, and so do their organizations. But I also want to work at some depth, so that we're not just dealing with current issues that they may be experiencing, but also that the coaching is helping them to gain some really deep insight into themselves and to make some changes in the way they approach situations that come up again and again, so that over time they've become more skillful and resourced as leaders, for example, in dealing with conflict, or dealing with their own perfectionism, or dealing with a lack of confidence, all these kinds of underlying issues that we all have. So that the psychodynamic approach helps me, I feel, work at two levels, help the coachees with particular goals that they have or issues they're dealing with, but also helps them to develop over the period of the coaching into more self-aware and skilled leaders who can then adapt what they've learned to all sorts of situations that they face.
And you're saying there that you've been doing this for over 20 years, and I'm curious around the changes that you've seen around, I guess, how organizations relate to coaching.
Yeah, it has changed a lot. When I started in the kind of mid to late 90s, it was very new, and coaching was a little bit stigmatized, actually. So it was felt that if you needed coaching as an executive or as a manager, it's because, there was something wrong, that you were in the remedial class, and it tended to be kept very quiet. And if possible, not even HR would know about it. Maybe the boss would sign it off, or somebody would sign it off themselves. And there was no real involvement of organizational stakeholders. And that has changed out of all recognition, as you know. So especially over the last 10 years or so, the HR and learning and development and talent communities within companies have really informed themselves about coaching, and kind of are usually now the gatekeepers. And there's much more thoughtfulness about who should have coaching, who would benefit from it, and what's expected from it as benefit, not just for the individual, but the organization. And I think now it's much more of a badge of honor if your organization invests in an executive coach for you, rather than a badge of shame. And that's absolutely great, because I would always advise HR people I work with, or organizations I work with, to invest, if budget is limited, invest in coaching for your best people, or those with highest potential. rather than people where there are serious performance issues, and coaching, the risk is coaching could be used as an alternative to management dealing with that. That said, I work with some incredibly talented people who nevertheless have some aspect of their behaviour that is really holding them back and causing problems. So in some cases, people are still sent to coaching to get something fixed, as it were. But very often it's more about supporting people in transition to a more senior role, or just helping them become even better than they are.
I think there's something really interesting around that idea that it used to be about fixing people, that you'd been bad or naughty, therefore you needed a coach. And also this idea that it can be used as a management tool to almost to oust people from an organization, and how that's shifted to a place of excellence and a place of development of potential and organizational stability and strength by bringing in coaches to work with them.
Yeah.
But there's one point there you was talking about how, you work at pace. And I was just curious about how you manage the organization's desire for pace and noticeable outcomes, but also the pace of coaching to create change.
I think it's a pressure that coaches can often feel, that the organization wants, great results in 6 sessions, for example, and yet, human development, adult learning and development doesn't happen overnight. And if it does happen too quickly, it can be very superficial. So there is always a tension there. But I think that the psychodynamic approach, which I can say a little bit more about in a moment, is one of the things that actually helps me to get a handle quite quickly on what I think are some of the underlying patterns that a new client who I've started working with, might have, and therefore how to help them fairly quickly to make some links and connections, and to have some aha moments, and to start trying to do things a bit differently and seeing if that works well for them. So the psychodynamic model is originally based on ideas from Freud, and is mostly known as something used by therapists. But in fact, what I've done with this model is really extract the key concepts that I think apply to coaching. And those are, some of them are quite far away from the original ideas, but are still often used by therapists now. And I've probably adapted them a little bit further to make them relevant for coaching. So the concepts that are most important and useful for me are, first of all, that human beings, as human beings, we all have unconscious thoughts and feelings, as well as the ones that we're aware of. And, there are some that we're kind of almost aware of, but hide a little bit from ourselves and perhaps hide from others, and some that they really are just blind spots. And psychodynamic, the dynamic part of that word, comes from this idea that, unconscious and conscious thoughts can move, or thoughts and feelings can move from being out of our conscious awareness to being into our conscious awareness. And therefore it's possible sometimes to help people access things going on in themselves that it will be useful for them to understand, but at the moment they're kind of not aware of. And the other key point that for me is so important is that emotions are the invisible drivers of so much of our thoughts and attitudes and behavior. And that if we try to coach without really looking for and wanting to understand the feelings that lie below what we do, we are missing something tremendously important. Because as human beings, we try to take a very rational approach to things, and to feel that there are always good reasons for what our views and what we decide to do. But the reality is that so much is driven by, often by painful and difficult feelings, and particularly the anxiety that everyday life can trigger in all of us. And we can be triggered by different things that make us anxious. But, we are sensitive organisms, and we are often anxious because our brains are wired to pick up on potential threat and create that feeling of physiological and emotional anxiety, because the human brain goes right back to early evolutionary times, and those kind of reptilian and very primitive parts of our brains are still there, as well as our incredibly advanced rational brains. And this is more and more well known now. So it's very easy at work if we have a conflict with a colleague, if we discover that a new member of our team has made a serious error and we are looking exposed, if our boss is critical out of the blue and we're not prepared for it, or we don't feel it's fair, so many issues. If we can't meet a deadline, if we feel overwhelmed by our workload, if we're just not sure what to do in a crisis, there's so many big and small experiences that we have at work and in life generally that trigger anxiety to one degree or another, and most of us cope with that most of the time. But the fact is, as again, we are all programmed to try to seek a sense of psychological safety. So I think babies are programmed not just to need, physical safety, food and shelter, but also psychological and emotional safety. And so when anxiety is triggered in our brains, it's natural for us to try to find ways to soothe ourselves and to reduce that anxiety. And that's where we often develop, we all develop patterns of defending ourselves against difficult or threatening feelings. And it's what I've really developed over the years is a way of identifying those patterns in an individual quite quickly. And I don't just then say to them, right, I've worked out your pattern, this is what it is. But for so many different reasons, that wouldn't work well. First of all, I can't be sure. I'm hypothesizing in my own mind and looking for evidence to check, am I on the right lines? And secondly, the last thing one wants to do as a coach is to trigger defenses by seeming to know better or telling the coachee something that may feel, humiliating or just plain wrong. So I've got quite a lot to say about how one shares ideas with a coachee. But in my own mind, I'm always thinking, what patterns can I see with this individual? How do they seem to have developed ways that work for them of keeping themselves fairly calm and feeling okay, even in the face of normal threats and anxieties?
This is all, incredibly fascinating as we talk about the evolution of the human mind, the human brain, and how defense mechanisms that were really useful for us at one point no longer are useful. Yeah. And I think this also plays into, the defense mechanisms that we sort of create as we're growing up. They become fixed to us without us even recognizing or noticing that. And so when we're in the work environment, we're being triggered, we're becoming defensive, and we're not even aware that that's happening. I love that phrase, the invisible drivers, emotions, the invisible drivers, how they're just there kind of pulling the strings of us as human beings, almost like the puppet master of our behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, how each person develops a characteristic or typical pattern of defenses, and we tend to be fairly consistent with that pattern throughout our lives. But you're absolutely right, Robert, that a lot of the shaping of that pattern will come through childhood experiences. I also think the genetics play an incredibly important part, that we do arrive, if you like, with a certain set of personality and temperamental preferences and tendencies, so that two children undergoing exactly the same experiences could nevertheless, because of their genetic makeup, deal with those experiences very differently and develop different patterns. One might be more about being proactive and angry and controlling as a way of dealing with very difficult experiences. The other might be very avoidant or very oppressed or whatever. So I think there's an enormous interaction between nature and nurture when we try to understand how our particular patterns have developed. But I think there's an important point here about the difference between therapy and coaching. That for me, it's much less in my coaching work about trying to understand why somebody has developed as they have. What was their family background? What were their kind of formative early experiences? Sometimes those things come up. But the way I approach it is much more trying to understand what is happening in the present. So in other words, looking at what pattern of behavior I can see in the workplace. What pattern of behavior are their colleagues perceiving, because 360-degree feedback or stakeholder interviews are always really useful. What patterns am I noticing as they interact with me as the coach? I find that hugely informative and useful to look at carefully. So in other words, I'm looking at how the patterns show up in the present, rather than focusing too much on the past and where they've come from. And I'm not saying that therapists only focus on the past and the childhood. That's a caricature, not the case. I think good therapists work with what's going on in the present. But there is a different emphasis there. I'm also looking very much at how these patterns show up and influence, for good or bad, in their role at work. So my aim is really to help the coachee become a better leader. And what that means is, you know, becoming more self-aware, having a wider range of choices as to how they behave, and being as skillful as they can, rather than perhaps only behaving in certain ways because, without even realizing it, they're avoiding other approaches. And I can give some examples if that would be helpful.
Yeah, we can jump into those in a moment. I just wanted to step back a little bit around these patterns of behavior, or the patterns that we notice showing up in the here and now relationship of the coaching itself, and how we can use what we're noticing in that space between us, in that relationship, as material or resources to explore what might be happening outside of this space. That idea that how the client shows up with us is how they show up to the world, or a possibility of how they show up to the world. And I know from reading your book that you bring a lot of I guess hypotheses about what might be going on to shape your questioning, and you also bring yourself into the conversation. So what you're noticing and what you're picking up, and sharing that with the client to then explore.
Yeah, I mean, I do find it really fascinating and very useful to think about the fact that when I first interact with a new client, particularly, and they don't really know me and I don't yet know them, so there's a lot of space for seeing how does the client react in a situation where they're coming to meet somebody they haven't really met. We may have spoken on the phone, they may have read my bio. Often it's going to be an exploratory session to see whether I'm the right coach for them and whether I feel I can help. And a lot of the sort of micro behaviors that happen over that boundary, even when it comes to, say, even arranging that first appointment, let alone in that first meeting, I feel can tell me a lot, give me a lot of information about how this person may well deal with other similar situations. And by a similar situation, I mean a situation in which there will be some anxiety for them, because first of all, the coach can be seen by a lot of people, or felt by a lot of people at some level, to be somebody who may judge them, who may identify their weaknesses or their flaws, simply by being there to look at them and their development and their issues. And so the person is often going to arrive to a first coaching session with some mixed feelings. They may be conscious, they may not, but they may be keen to meet the coach and looking forward to it and totally positive about it at a conscious level, but there'll still be some anxiety there as well. So the little behaviors that can happen between us, I think, can be very telling. I mean, recently, for example, I was contacted by a coachee who was very keen, very, very senior in her own company, running with a partner, her own successful company, and she wanted coaching. She was really keen. We had an initial chat, but it took several months, in fact, before we had an exploratory meeting, because she was so overwhelmed with work. She was repeatedly cancelling, to the point where I began to think, you know what, really, if she gets in touch again, I'm going to have to say, is this the right time for you to enter coaching? Because you know, it's clearly difficult. And if we work together, there has to be a commitment to having the sessions regularly, otherwise it doesn't work. Now, when we finally actually had that meeting, it became very clear that she was feeling overwhelmed at work because she'd been there only about 6 months. It was an exciting opportunity, excuse me, to set up and run this business. And she wanted to make a good impression. She wanted to learn the business. So she was saying no to absolutely nobody. In other words, anyone who wanted to see her, anyone she felt she should give her time to, she would. So her life outside work was suffering. She was working, you know, 12 or 13-hour days. Her diary had no gaps in it whatsoever. And she wanted coaching really to help her with this issue. But at the same time, the one thing she'd been able to say no to were the coaching meetings. And that already, for instance, was telling me that, first of all, she had mixed feelings probably about the coaching because she knew she was in a bit of a mess. And did she really want to stop and look at that? So the coaching exploration meeting kept being postponed. And the other thing that occurred to me is that the coaching was really something for her. And yet that was coming last on the list. So, you know, she was putting everybody else's needs first. And this was something that was going to help her cope better, feel better, nourish herself. And it was coming last. And so, you know, just through, in a way, events that happened before we even met, looking at them when I did then hear about the issues she was dealing with, it kind of made sense. Now, that's a hypothesis. And somebody else could say, well, maybe she was just very busy and she just couldn't make those meetings. And, you know, why read so much into it? But when we were exploring, I began to see that it was part of a pattern. And it was a part of a pattern that involved also putting her family last, even though that was causing her a lot of pain and guilt. She wanted to spend time with her children, but she kind of felt that she couldn't because that was indulgent. At the moment, she had to give everything to work. So there were a number of things that were emerging around what she was struggling with that kind of seemed to indicate that a hypothesis that, you know, she found it hard to balance her own needs with the needs, the perceived needs of others, you know, had some weight. Now, of course, I didn't just immediately share this in a blunt fashion, but it started the process of my understanding what was, you know, getting in the way for this very capable person of doing a great job at work, but managing some boundaries as well. Because apart from anything else, apart from the stress and strain on her of saying yes to everything, she was spending a lot of time doing activities that somebody less senior could do. And my own model of good leadership indicates or includes the view that leaders should be working on things that only they can do. And if somebody in the team, somebody lower down, can be supported to take on a responsibility or task, they should be. And the leader then can be freed up to work at a more strategic level and to develop others. So it meant that she was not doing the most effective job for her business and certainly not for herself, by being so driven by other people's demands and so unable to set these boundaries. So, you know, that giving and giving and giving was probably a defense, if you like, that was part of her pattern of defenses that probably developed quite early in life, that allowed her not allowed her to feel that she was being a very good and responsive person, avoided unpleasant feelings of being selfish or you know, rejecting by saying no, and it kind of probably worked for her to a large degree, in that she's very popular at work and is obviously a lovely person, and so there's quite a payoff for being an over-giver, if you like. But of course, there's a price. And the more senior you become at work, often the more the price becomes obvious. Because when you get to the level that she is now in her business, she absolutely needs to be able to be more selective about what she does. And she needs to be able to get off the hamster's wheel of endless just one thing after the other, to think more strategically, as I say. And the benefits for her, if she can be helped to do that, will be for her business, will be certainly for her at work, and also I think for her and her family outside work too. So I'm always looking to try and understand what the patterns are as quickly as possible, not assuming I'm right, but looking for evidence that might confirm or not the hypothesis, and then aiming to help the client to deal with specific issues as they arise, but also to have an underlying developmental journey that will help them over their whole lives.
I really enjoy this idea of noticing those little things and seeing where they fit within the pattern. I think sometimes as coaches, we can just see the big stuff and what the client is presenting, and there's something about staying open to and aware of what are the little interactions that take place, and what might they tell us, or where may they fit into this picture or tapestry of the client as we work with them, and allowing that to generate a hypothesis without, as you say, naming that hypothesis as being true and to be acted upon, but just a way of creating a framework for ourselves to house our own thinking and our own exploration and investigation into what's taking place with our clients.
Absolutely. And I can give another quick example of somebody recently where, when I had that first meeting with him, it was difficult quite to understand why he had asked for coaching, because he kind of filled the time with descriptions of all his successes and how well he'd done. And, clearly I had some ideas. I'd been briefed by HR and I had some thoughts already about areas that he wanted to work on. But when we actually had that first meeting, again, remembering how anxiety is often quite high, even if the person isn't aware of it, I could see that perhaps part of his pattern was that, it was important to him to protect himself against criticism. And though I was absolutely not planning to offer any criticism, I wasn't even given the chance really to get much of a word in edgeways. And I was being continually told by him about all his successes. So, which is a bit strange, because after all, you're coming to coaching to outline some areas where you'd like to work on and you'd like some help. But understanding that people are anxious when they first come to see the coach, and understanding that we all have patterns of defense, and that one of them might be, I'm going to get all my good successes in first, so I'm not open to any criticism here, and I'm not going to even give the person much space to say anything critical. That helps me not to take that behavior at face value, because I think it would be easy just to say, well, why are you here? What do you really want for coaching? You seem to be great at everything, and what's the issue? And a psychodynamic approach tells me this person possibly is feeling quite insecure and anxious that he might be criticized. So what might I do that would be helpful and reduce that anxiety in the first session? And it's kind of steer into the skid. So what I did, which was not difficult because I genuinely felt this, is I just really pretty much for most of the session just said, gosh, that sounds amazing. And that's incredibly impressive. And tell me a bit more about, how you got that promotion and so on. So in other words, I really got alongside that potential client by, celebrating with him all his successes and helping him, therefore, to experience me as genuinely supportive and not as a threat. And in fact, when we went on to have a second session, it was a very different dynamic, and he was far more open about the areas that he wanted to work in. And I felt that, a trust had been built very quickly, because I had been able to read between the lines and do what he needed at that point, which was to absolutely focus on his strengths and his achievements.
That reading between the lines reminds me of something that I often sort of explore is, you know, hearing the unspoken. What's not being presented here?
Exactly.
Who's being left out of the story? And to kind of notice that without going, there is somebody, but just exploring what's not here that might be here, and what might be the reasoning for that. And I think there's something really interesting in kind of noticing that stuff as we're working with our clients. And there was something else you said earlier about psychological safety, reminding me of some of the stuff that Brené Brown talks about around, you know, psychological safety within teams around leadership.
Absolutely.
And I guess it kind of leads into this idea of the coaching relationship and how we create that coaching agreement, that coaching dynamic that allows us to join forces, to look at, to explore, so that the client can be vulnerable in that space when working with us.
Yeah, I mean, in the book that I wrote about my approach, I have what I think is a really key kind of chapter in there, which I've called Getting Alongside the Client. And, you know, for me, that is so important, because if, you know, we may have the best intellectual understanding in the world of what's going on for this client, we may or we may not, but let's say we're right about some of the things they do that they're not even aware that they're doing, that are not serving them very well. If we were to share that simply as a piece of cognitive information, the chances are that it would land badly, because by definition, if we have blind spots and somebody just comes along and says, you've got this blind spot, what you're really doing is X or Y, and you know what you're trying to do, nobody wants to be told that, you know, someone else can kind of read their mind or knows better than they do what they're thinking or feeling. And as I've said again and again, it's very easy for all of us to feel, you know, attacked or undermined in our self-esteem, in our role at work. You know, if well-meant, helpful observations are not couched in a really tactful way. So that's why I was, especially when I'm supervising other coaches, I you know, and they're relatively new to the field, one of the things that can be a trap is that they think, I've had an aha moment about what's probably going on for this client, and I'm going to share it immediately. And I think it's really important for the coach to be doing a lot of thinking about what might be happening, and to use their own expertise and experience and judgment to have a view. I'm absolutely not of the school of coaching that thinks that the coach's role is only to ask questions and, you know, that the client has all the answers. I think it's about collaborative working, and I want to bring my own you know, offering to that. But it's one thing to be thinking these things, and it's another thing then to decide, how am I going to maybe suggest something, or how am I going to frame something in a very tentative way, that, and a very sympathetic way, that will really be heard and will be acceptable to the to the coachee. So, you know, for example, again, I've been working with someone else who has been dealing with a really sort of dreadful bullying situation from somebody in her team, and so this is a peer relationship, but a lot of people have been suffering from, you know, very, very poor behavior from a colleague. And because she is somebody who is very collaborative, very much a people person, and who kind of tends to maybe have a slight rose-tinted spectacles view on things, she has found it very difficult to take a firm stance against unacceptable behavior, either towards herself or on behalf of others, not because she doesn't approve of it, but because she is somehow unable to allow herself to kind of see how irrationally badly some people can sadly behave at times. And because she couldn't imagine behaving like that, she's struggled to really get her head around the unacceptability of someone else's behavior, and has tended to see it more as, well, they must be very stressed, maybe, you know, and make excuses almost. Not because she thinks the behavior is okay, but because she's struggling to see it, if you like, in all its very unpleasant reality. Now, you know, my approach to this with the client was, first of all, really to emphasize what a wonderful quality it is that she is so good at empathizing with others. She is so strong at being consensual and collaborative. And she's also such a principled person that it's really hard for her to imagine how somebody could be behaving badly. However, that may mean that, you know, she is being just that little bit too patient with this person before actually calling them out on their behavior. And that being a bit too patient comes from those good qualities, but actually isn't serving her terribly well. So, and then if that works, and if the person says, yeah, you know, I think you're right, you know, you are right, or I get, yeah, you know, I do that, then, you know, a little door has opened, and I can say, well, let's explore how you might be a little bit less patient, or let's explore what setting some boundaries here or addressing this issue might look like. You know, so it's, but if she had come back and said, no, that doesn't make any sense at all, the whole thing is, you know, different, I see different, then I would have, you know, left it and come back another way, another time with a different route. So that delicacy in really all the time protecting, if you like, the client's ego, because we all have sensitive egos to, you know, about different things and in different ways. That's really critical to how I work. But if one can do that, you can build trust so quickly that I'm always astonished, or I'm often astonished, as to how quickly the coaching can move to very honest conversations where I'm really saying, look, I can see why you've developed this way of doing this, and it reflects one of your strengths, but it's been taken a bit too far. And it's served you quite well in some ways, but it's just not proving helpful to you anymore. And we need to look at, you know, what you could do to modify this. It's not about knocking away people's defenses, but it's about saying, you know, I think it would serve you better if you could, for example, get to the point where you could have tough conversations with poor performers, or you could, you know, be less task focused and actually develop some coaching skills with people in your team, even though that makes you very impatient and irritable, which I understand, you know, it can be very frustrating. So I'm always empathizing and alongside, but I'm always trying to move them along a constructive path at the same time. You know, I'm quite an impatient person. I like to see results. And I've learned the way you have to achieve that, you have to be incredibly sensitive and careful. But at the same time, I really enjoy seeing clients make those shifts and kind of have those aha moments and just massively widen often their repertoire of how they can handle with all the challenges that they face in their responsibilities and their roles at work.
I really like what you were saying, and something that really stood out for me was this piece of you know, protecting the client's ego, not in a sense of, you know, becoming the rescuer to the client, but recognizing that if we attack the ego, we create a defense in that
Exactly.
client can't get in.
Exactly.
So that, you know, how the language, the subtlety of the language we use are witnessing and affirming the client, the empathy that has to sit in what's in the space between us and the client, how important that is to build that trust, so that we can both lean into the challenge because they recognize that we see the good in them, as
Absolutely.
well as what might need to be shifted and changed.
Spot on, absolutely.
And it makes me think about how, as coaches, how do we do the work ourselves so that we can think what's working with our clients, how we can reflect after sessions, during sessions, before sessions, so that we're able to deploy that sensitivity, and we're able to wait and hesitate. We don't just jump in and say. And I think I know you talk about it in your book about, you know, what's the work that we need to do as coaches in order to be at our best within the coaching relationship.
I think that's so important. You know, to work in the way that I'm outlining, one has to have a lot of self-awareness to start with, because if, you know, and of course, I will have my own blind spots and patterns of defense and so on, like everybody else, but I've done a lot of work on myself that means I have a high level of awareness around my weak spots, if you like, or my tendencies to to defend myself in one form or behavior or another. Doesn't mean to say I don't always fall into the trap of doing it, but it does mean that I will be looking at myself at the same time. If I work with a client and I have a particularly positive response to them, or a negative response, or I find them frustrating, or irritating, or just difficult to really warm to, or whatever my kind of subjective response is, as opposed to my professional approach, I will pay attention to that, and I will ask myself: is that something? Is it me? Am I just in a bad mood? Have something happened in my life so that I wasn't at my best and was easily irritated or easily over engaged, or whatever it might have been? Or is it maybe something in that individual that they trigger in others, including me? And these concepts are the transference and the countertransference concepts that are there in psychodynamic therapy, but also I apply in a very everyday way in the coaching, because I'm always looking for those clues. But I can only tell whether it's me or whether it's the coachee if I have a fairly high level of self-awareness, if I've done quite a lot of work on myself. So I think that's very important. One of the things, and I see this so often when I supervise, and I remember it from early on when I was first coaching, it's very difficult when you first start coaching not to be more anxious about your own performance and more focused on whether you're doing a good job and whether you're delivering value, than actually be focused on the other person, on the client. And so that comes in as well, that we have to develop early on as coaches, and this is difficult, somehow enough self-confidence to be able, when coaching, to put aside our performance anxiety and really focus entirely on the coachee. Because I've seen this so often that, if the coach is sitting there thinking, I'm not really doing a good job, this person won't want to work with me, they're not going to choose me, and I may not get any more clients from this company, or I think I'm missing things, I've really got no idea where to start. They're thinking about themselves all the time during the session, and that gets in the way of this getting alongside the client, because, to be honest, the client is not thinking 99 times out of 100, is this coach good enough? Sometimes they may be coming in with that view, but most of the time they are talking about their own stuff, and once they get going, that's what they're focused on. And so that's self-awareness and self-management that we need to be able really to be available fully to focus on the coachee is quite a challenge, I think, when one's starting out, but is really important. Otherwise, one is not there alongside them, one is not protecting their ego, one is worrying about one's own.
And that's really interesting, because earlier you were talking about, the client's anxiety that they bring into the space and how that creates their own defense mechanisms or triggers defense mechanisms. And then we've got the coach's performance anxiety coming into the space, triggering their defense mechanisms. And if we're not careful, what we have in that space is loads of defense happening.
Definitely.
And it sort of reminds me of when I talk to coaches and they seem very stuck in their coaching with the client. And I'm just in this moment, I'm wondering, is that because too much defense is at play and we haven't done the work to kind of meet our client and to lean in to our client, as you say, that kind of getting alongside the client, that hasn't really taken place enough yet for us to both be vulnerable in that space and to be focusing on the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can create a bit of a block or sterility within that coaching relationship, and mainly it can mean that there isn't enough sense of safety for one or both of the partners to really proceed, because it does need vulnerability on both sides, because I don't know for sure if I'm going to be able to help somebody, and certainly they don't know initially whether they're psychologically safe when they first come to coaching, or whether it's going to deliver value for them and be a good investment of time and and money on the part of their company. So there are, of course, in any venture like this, there are a lot of question marks and a lot of risks, and so it's really so important to create that sense of safety at the beginning. And if the coaches can focus initially on that empathy, really trying to see the world and feel the world through the eyes of this individual, And you might find the individual a bit very different from you, or you might even not warm to them, or you might find them difficult to understand and not really get it. But if one just focuses to start with on the empathy and that connection, and then the rapport follows, because you are showing that you really are there. You're bringing yourself, your warmth, your concern, your wish to work with them, and you're picking up on what they need to hear, whether it's having their strengths noted, whether it's empathy around a difficult experience they've been through, or a loss that they've had at work, or whether it's through acknowledging that they are quite task focused and want to kind of get on with things. And absolutely, we can do that. So it's just that tuning in and creating a sense of partnership and safety at the beginning really lays the basis then for doing some amazing work. And it can be done often more quickly, I think, than people fear. But that basis is the starting point.
Catherine, it's a delight having this conversation with you. I feel that we could discuss this for hours and hours on end, and I'd love to invite you back to continue this conversation with us. But before we bring this to an end, I'm just curious as to where might you see your work going or growing to in the future?
Well, I already do quite a bit of work with other coaches, as well as with coachees, with clients, which I do enjoy very much. I've also been the last few years several times to China, where there's a burgeoning interest in coaching and executive coaching. And there's an extraordinary level of enthusiasm and openness among the variety of people who've attended the programs I've run there, and who have absolutely taken to the way in which I work, taken to the idea actually of working with emotion and with empathy as something that is quite new to them, but at the same time chimes. And that's been enormously rewarding. And of course, in the world we're in right now with the pandemic, trips I had to other places abroad that were kind of in the pipeline to, again, have the pleasure and stimulation of sharing in different cultures something of how I work, where coaching is becoming perhaps bigger, now, but obviously it's not as developed as in much of Europe or the States. I mean, I guess now I'm thinking more about online work of that kind. I would like to write another book to follow up, because the first one had an awful lot of case studies and examples in it. It has in it, but I'm quite interested in writing a further book based on more detailed case studies that I think might help to bring the ideas alive. And the actual work I do with clients, as I said right at the beginning, that never fails to really stimulate my thinking and give me enormous enjoyment and satisfaction. So continuing with a full caseload of really interesting and varied, mainly quite senior people in all sorts of organizations, that will definitely continue to be a part of what I do.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. It's really stimulated my own thinking, my own thoughts, my own ideas about how I coach and the work that I do. So thank you so much for that. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Well, it's been my pleasure too, Robert. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.